Before I realized that I might just be a little bit into oil paint, I used to do a lot of colored pencil drawings, where the subject matter was often a melancholy lady in a trippy place. The way I blended and used colored pencils in a layering fashion, I was almost wishing that I was painting with them without even knowing it. When I began to learn oil painting, I jumped right in, applying the oil paint similarly to the method in which I was accustomed to drawing with colored pencils. Lots of smooth blending. There's nothing wrong with applying paint thin and blending smooth when it makes sense to do so, but I was only doing that. And one of the most potentially interesting parts of painting is the whole world of texture that can be explored by manipulating physicality of the paint on the surface in more expressive ways, with varied brushstrokes and varying paint thicknesses. And I was unaware of the possibilities. I was ignoring this element of texture vital to oil painting and all things, and I began for moments to tentatively explore surface texture here and there and attempt more variety in my brushstrokes, but my exploration was hesitant, especially when I was trying to capture an observed likeness. Recently, it occurred to me that I had not painted a portrait in quite a few years. It seemed time to revisit painting people faces to see how I might approach it at this point in my art-making journey. This is one of a series of portrait paintings I recently started to gauge how I would go back to approaching a portrait now that I have a little bit more experience and understand the direction that I'm trying to push myself to explore more expressive means. As we will come to see, this one is fail. Fail at pushing myself far enough and striking the balance that I sought, but it is always a success to attempt and observe your process as an information gathering tool to see where you stand and recognize where your tendencies exist in your stage of evolution. So as you've seen, I begin with an underpainting. Underpaintings are a way to map out composition, shape, and value. I start this underpainting in bright pinks simply because I like to look at it, and I often tie in those colors later so it plays all right with subsequent layers. Often underpaintings for figure art will be done in a neutral color, such as a burnt umber or a burnt sienna. Burnt sienna and a bit of ultramarine blue are a good place to start to create a range of neutral values. For a wipe away method, which I'll attempt here, oh god, nope, too much turbinoid in it. Oh, it's melting. You want to almost have the paint mixed with enough thinner turbinoid or Gamsol to create a tonal watercolor-esque drawing on the canvas. And you'll use a rag to wipe away and dab up highlighted areas. It's simply mapping for yourself. I clearly don't do this that often. Another method is more direct placement, where after a quick line drawing, you map in the value in the color with more opaque paint, the color still being a range of neutrals. I mixed burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, and some white, a little bit of red. I tend to get too specific too quickly as one of my weaknesses. You want to start more general because it will be inefficient to put too much detail before you have larger composition all blocked in. It can also be detrimental to envisioning the painting's basic elements as a whole if you start very specifically on an eye or something. General to the specific is still a good rule to follow in painting as well as drawings, but I sometimes add more detail before it's necessary in lower layers. I got bad habits. You can also redraw the wipe away method easily by using thinner on a brush to almost erase. I'm shifting the wonky eyeball a little bit over here. Okay, these aren't the shabbiest things of all time. Maybe I should do things like this more, like practice or something. Temp neutrals, but nope, I had to stare at pink. I'm seeking new and different process. I probably should have started it differently than I had previously done before. But this was also an assessment of where I was and just seeing what would happen when I go back into painting a person. I'm not sure what I'm going for though, and that's where just needing to try things comes in. So at this stage, I'm attempting to get more paint on the canvas. Thicker, opaque. So because it's so opaque, the rendering of my underpainting didn't need to be so specific, but still some of those colors and textures will show through and build a more interesting surface. Here in this second layer, I'm essentially relying on complementary colors, violet and yellow, to further map in value because I'm not quite sure how I want to open this up yet. I don't know where I want to go. And I know this will be a color combination that I understand and enjoy. Complementary colors are the colors across from each other on the color wheel. I don't know what a color wheel is? Please tell me. Of course. Okay, you've got your primaries, red, yellow, blue. Those mix to make orange, green, violet, the secondaries. A secondary plus a primary will mix to make a tertiary. The tertiary colors are red-orange, yellow-green, blue-green, blue-violet, red-violet. As a general rule, complementary colors go well together. They create a vibrancy in their contrast that is appealing. They also mix to important, vibrant neutrals. I'm color challenged because I love too much all the time, and sometimes working with two complementary colors is a simplified way to please my hue addiction while staying limited and with colors that balance and mix to pleasing neutrals. I also know I like purples and yellows in my shadows and highlights respectively, so having these hues that possibly will show through in layered painting, it works. But what's this? Okay, I decided I'm playing it a little too safe. I was a little too thin with my paint. I was just doing the same thing over again. As I was trying to push that unsuccessfully, I tend to exaggerate and imagine hues in my references, and now I guess I'm going greens. I think I may be misstepping down an undead zombified stage. It's all right that I'm kind of testing something and trying more over top. Oil paint, you can layer as much as you want, but when you do, you are supposed to follow a general rule called fat over lean. Basically, fat over lean states that subsequent layers of a painting should contain more oil content. A lower layer should have lower oil content, and as you paint in higher layers, you have higher oil content, respectively. This is because of how oil paint dries. Now, oil paint can feel dry to the touch and ready to work on, but the real hardening time happens over many years. I say hardening because unlike water-based paints, oil paint does not dry by vaporization. Oil paint hardens by oxidation, which means it actually takes oxygen from the air. And this is the first stage to polymerization, which is the molecules in the oil linking together into long chains. Then those chains cross-link, further hardening, a process that can continue for years and years. The science magic of all this is exactly like these diagrams, basically. Because the oil paint is actually gaining oxygen as it hardens, the layers that dry first expand and change. This is why you want the lower layers of the painting to dry first, while the upper layers are still flexible and unhardened. Ooh, yeah. If the upper layers dry first, in drying, they become rigid and inflexible, and they run the risk of cracking over time as the lower layers finally begin to dry, expanding underneath them. In like a bunch of years, but. So how do we achieve this? Thinners, terpenoid, or Gamsol, odorless mineral spirits, can leanify the oil paint for a first layer, like we saw in the wipe away method. You can take your fancy-dancy medium mixing cup, put a splash of terpenoid, and use that with your brush to apply the first layer of paint. Your second layer, therefore, might just be oil paint. Third layer, we might take some of our fat oil medium. I had some linseed stand oil nearby, or you could use linseed oil. Now, where it gets a little tricky is gelkid is considered a fat, but it isn't an oil, it's an alkyd resin, and it actually speeds drying. But the key is that it increases flexibility. Liquin, too. There's some debate over its fat status, but it also speeds drying and increases flexibility. So we could say that fat over lean can also mean flexible over less flexible. So for this third layer, you add a dollop of your fat and dip your brush in that when you're adding the paints. And if you make a subsequent layer, like a fourth layer, you add another dollop to the same cup, so you're always having more medium content. Basically, have a little side bowl or side cup, start with a little bit of thinner in it, add a little bit more medium every layer, and get your brush in there. Now, do I always do this? I mean, initially, when I started painting, I didn't even know to use mediums. I was just painting in oils and using my terpenoid for brush cleaning. And even now, sometimes I'm dealing with possibly self-imposed painting conditions that lead to a very loose interpretation of these rules. I'm sure in like 50 years, if I'm still alive, some of my paintings where I strayed from the layering techniques that are proper, they may start to crack a little. I'm pretty sure at that point on Earth, there will be more pressing matters to worry about than a couple cracks in my painting. The takeaway is that you can layer painting as much as you'd like, and of course it is good to try to learn about and follow the techniques that help keep the integrity of the surface for many millennia to come. But don't worry too much when you start learning. Don't let all the mediums overwhelm you. I'm constantly still trying new things. I have so much to learn, and I will continue to have much to learn till whatever apocalypse. So you can always feel overwhelmed, just start with some paint. I like to exaggerate saturation of hues and even imagine colors and shadows and highlights on flesh tones, but then still pull it back to a skin tone adjacent. But I think this was too uniform, too blended, and then I just am not feeling it, breaking it up. I was ultimately doing the same thing as I often did in previous portraits and really struggling to move beyond that in any useful way. Maybe some artists know exactly how they're going to make everything they start to make, and I sometimes have a very clear initial vision, but I also certainly experiment. And with experimentation and uncertainty in process come some problematic layers that hopefully become learning experiences. Hopefully I grow a little bit from the failed experiments and take note of what I might want to adjust for next time. I definitely love painting in layers and think about building color through layers, but a few of these layers were seemingly inefficient to the end result because they were not being applied translucently enough for colors to build up and shine through. But it was still useful to me to explore and see where I stand. Trying to push yourself outside your box and develop new processes often filled with seemingly inefficient tests and layers and practice that you still can learn from. And sometimes I have to react to the paint on the surface in order to envision what I'm going to do next. Or I'll have something expressive that I over-refine, and then I realize that I enjoyed it in a previous layer. But I have to learn by overworking sometimes. An example is probably this lady's eye area. I like the way her eyes and surrounding flesh look in this slightly more expressive state here, more than I do after I put the final layer on the painting. But now I know. Each attempt to loosen up was a little bit timid. Sometimes when painting with a reference, I get all tight and caught up in what I think it should look like instead of allowing myself to loosen up outside my preconceived box of notions to react to the paint physicality and other creative impulses that might distort or change the figure in interesting expressive ways. This is the direction I hope to slowly grow towards. We will see. It didn't happen here. And I didn't really achieve a very new process with all this. And I'm not in love with my painting. But I was a bit more painterly and expressive. I had some variation in texture. I probably need to get better at direct application of color instead of always thinking in layers, where my tendencies have been to smooth out expressive elements. A balance of both, perhaps. I'm not really sure where that balance I seek is yet between spatially conscious rendering and abstracted expressive paint. I have to just think and spend some studio time staring at art, thinking about art, looking at other art. It can be frustrating when you don't necessarily achieve what you want to in a painting, or even really know what exactly you're trying for. But it's all part of the process of discovering new process, and exploring helps figure out the various avenues of practice that can help you grow towards whatever goals you might have. If painting a figure, I want to capture some energy that I have in my drawings of more expressive, sketchy, human cyborg, octopus hybrids, but in paint, while still indulging in the fun of rendering flesh from life and reference. I need to try to make myself apply paint in completely different ways. Further understand paint physicality, I must attempt some craziness way outside my comfort zone to find the new balance that I'm hunting. I definitely didn't achieve it here, but I still like this lady I painted, even with her noticeable affection for spray tanning that I guess I'm responsible for. She helped me to jump back in and see now where I am artistically when I go back to exploring bases and paint. And there will be much more magical exploration, lots of practice, lots of marvelous learning, wonderful, informative failures. We never love everything we make, but it's still so valuable to make it.
We are super fun.
It's gonna be a lot more learning.
Now, do me like one of your tentacle girls.